Alright, hello. This is a vintage deck. This is the deck I played in the RCQ yesterday, November 13th. This is also very similar to the deck I played on Saturday in the Vintage Challenge. It's a deck I've been playing a lot online lately. This Lurrus Breach deck is really, really good. And it's good in ways that make up for the lack of Tinker. That's kind of the big cost to playing with Lurrus. But I had a lot of fun in the event, in both of the events. I really enjoy this archetype, and even though I'm kind of closing out Vintage for the next couple of weeks to focus on Pioneer for the regional championships in Atlanta, I do kind of want to close out the format with a bit of a review of the RCQ matches and a little bit about the deck, since this deck is really interesting. It's actually some of the most fun I've had playing Magic in at least the last couple of years. I've explored more formats lately. I learned Legacy in 2020 and 2021, and I started learning Vintage a couple of months ago, in September and October, and I've really liked it. There's a lot here. So the deck itself is relatively straightforward. It's mostly built around the Underworld Breach combo, which for anyone unfamiliar, let's parse out this deck list a little bit. So we have Underworld Breach, we have Brain Freeze, and we have Black Lotus. And so these three cards together, when you have all three and sufficient mana to cast them, the game essentially always ends. So there's a few ways to interact with this. You can say Mind Break, trap the Brain Freeze or the Black Lotus. You can Force of Vigor the Underworld Breach. But as we'll find here, Lurrus really complicates a lot of the plans for dealing with Underworld Breach itself, because in the mid-game, what this deck can really threaten to do with surprising regularity is, in the early games, you play kind of a normal blue soup game plan of just play broken cards and progress the game until you're on turn 2, 3, or 4. And then as soon as you start threatening the Breach combo, Lurrus allows you to rebuy the breaches in subsequent turns. So you can do things like threaten the Breach combo on turn 3, and if your opponent deals with it, maybe you trade a couple of resources back and forth, but ultimately your breach ends up in your graveyard. Well, the following turn you can often rebuy it with Lurrus and do cool things like Lurrus, rebuy Underworld Breach, recast Time Walk, untap, do it all again, except this time you don't have to cast the Lurrus or call up the Lurrus with the companion tax. And so in the mid game, you end up just basically throwing Haymaker after Haymaker against your opponent, and eventually something sticks. So, Black Lotus, busted card. It does not take a card like Underworld Breach to break Black Lotus, but part of what's so cool about these Breach decks is Black Lotus becomes not just a free ritual, but it becomes an actual combo piece. And we don't have Urza's Saga to take advantage of that fully. There are lists that do, but that's a slightly separate archetype. So parsing out vintage decks is actually something I've kind of really started to like, because all the blue decks play the same core cards. You're all playing all of this. But figuring out what kind of bucketing these cards together and turning it in your head to a quote-unquote a normal Magic deck is a really fun skill. So here we have one. Let's go through the threats first. So we have 2 Ragavans, we have a Ledger Shredder, 2 Arcanists, and then we have our Lurrus. And these are our permanent threats, right? Technically Underworld Breach, technically some of this can count as permanent threats depending on the board state, but really this is what you're looking for on turn 1 or 2 to establish a threat and kind of put your opponent in check. So all three of these creatures, to varying degrees, do that. If you have an unchecked Ragavan, the game isn't over, especially not in Vintage. This card is actually a little worse in Vintage than it was in Legacy, and maybe even in Modern. But it's still a really, really good threat that you can deploy on turn 1 with backup. And then Arcanist and Ledger Shredder are kind of the same thing, but on 2. They both do different things better than the other. Ledger Shredder, importantly, pitches to Force of Will. Also importantly, is extremely bad against Hull Breacher. And this format has a lot of Hull Breachers around, so that explains the 2-1 split. I think you could play, workshopping this deck ahead of the event with the eventual winner, second place finisher, Kane. They played, I think, an additional Ragavan and an additional Ledger Shredder. This space, you can probably put whatever you want here. And as long as you're playing powerful, proactive threats, I think you can manage. So we also have kind of a critical mass of cards for Lurrus. So this deck isn't a very good Lurrus deck, despite how good Lurrus is with Breach. Lurrus is mostly there because it's a very low opportunity cost to pass up Tinker in these shells. Because mostly you can rebuy Breach, but also Lurrus is really good with Mishra's Bauble. It's always been really good with Mishra's Bauble. You can play some number of other cards here instead. I went down from 4 baubles to 3. I think the answer may be to play maybe 2 baubles and have one more piece of action in here. But being able to always have something in the mid-game for your Lurrus is really, really important. And anytime you deploy a Lurrus and don't have something to bring back, it's trouble. So this deck also plays an extra Mox. It's playing the Jet. The Sapphire, Ruby, and Pearl are pretty automatic inclusions because you literally use all of those mana. The Mox Jet is just another source for Lurrus. The initial version of the list that I stole did not have the Jet. I think this is a pretty non-trivial improvement. You also have a number of ways to launder that colorless mana into the Arcanists and Shredders, and then also into Underworld Breach itself. And in some of your turn 2s and turn 3s get a lot easier to combo kill when you have that Mox mana. For interaction here, we've got 2 Swords to Plowshares, 2 Pyroblasts, 1 Flusterstorm, and then we have the kind of default Gitaxian Probe and Mental Misstep. These cards are pretty important. The Flusterstorm is the worst of this bunch. I think in some builds you may want a 3rd Pyroblast here instead. I really don't like Flusterstorm. I think in general Pyroblast does what you want it to do a little better, but Flusterstorm covers things like Yawgmoth's Will and Demonic Tutor in ways that Pyroblast just simply cannot. And Swords to Plowshares is the reason to play white. So this deck, aside from Swords to Plowshares, could be a Grixis deck. The thing you gain from being white is literally swords. Swords is the best way to cover Vengevines and Hollow Ones while also being able to take out things like Ragavan and Collector Oof, Thalia. Just basically, it hits anything and everything, and the life really doesn't matter because mostly you are going to be progressing towards a Breach kill or an overwhelming Lurrus advantage where the amount of life that you give your opponent, you're rarely, like, literally racing them. And then we're also playing 4 Force of Will. That's a given. This list plays a single Force of Negation. I think it's maybe the worst card in the main deck. I don't really like Force of Negation. I board it out often. I guess it's kind of a nod to shops and prison shops, and then it's an okay backup plan against literally Tinker. And then we have a lot of card advantage. So Dig Through Time is literal card advantage. We've got Merchant Scroll and Time Walk and all the usuals. But the cool one here is Consider. These are normally preordains, but Consider I think is really, really good. This was another Kane suggestion. Being instant speed matters because you are playing a lot of turn 1 interaction that you want to be able to hold up in Pyroblast especially, but also Flusterstorm. And so that's non-trivial. Not a big, you know, you'd play Preordain anyway if that was the only difference. But Surveil 1 is actually quite interesting here because there are some breach kills on turns 1 and 2 where you just end up being a card short in your graveyard. And there were times in the event yesterday where I was casting Consider with the intention of binning virtually every card. And that's something that Preordain can't do. I think Preordain is generally a stronger card, but this is the first time I have tried Consider in that space, and I'm kind of... I'm sold. I didn't like Preordain in these shelves to begin with. It exposes you to Hull Breacher a little more, and it's a little bit of a clunky card in these early turns, but here it's fantastic. Consider is fantastic. So then Brain Freeze is literal, just combo card. I wish we didn't have to play it. I prefer compact combos that win the game, even if they're virtual kills. Versus the literal kills. Brain Freeze is just too powerful. And it's got some fun corner cases with Lurrus where sometimes you want to just Brain Freeze in the dark just to set up a better Lurrus. You know, if you can, say, call up your Lurrus on turn 3 and maybe have a little bit of extra mana but can't cast it, you know, maybe you Brain Freeze end of turn to set up a Mishra's Bauble or a Lotus or even just a Mox in your graveyard so you have something that your Lurrus can essentially cantrip into. And then that closes out the deck except for the lands and more card advantage. So these slots here, I don't really like the iterations. They're difficult to cast. But the cards are really powerful. You need something to kind of claw back into games when, you know, maybe you've cast a Force of Will or two. Maybe you had to kind of either go all in to protect one of your threats or to stop your opponent from landing one of theirs. Expressive Iteration is just the cleanest way to make up for that. And I board them out pretty aggressively in Wasteland games, either when I am planning on being Wasteland heavy or my opponent is. And then Dress Down was the third iteration. I played Dress Down yesterday because it covers Saga a little better. Basically, Wasteland is really, really good at checking Saga. In fact, that's kind of one of the main draws to this deck is that we can play Wastelands instead of Sagas. But the problem is if they get their Saga online a turn before you Wasteland, or unfortunately sometimes they just get both chapters 2 and 3 online and can make 2 constructs, you sometimes just need a way to clean up multiple constructs. Dress Down does that. It does it in a way that also draws a card and pitches to Force of Will. So it kind of does a little bit of everything. And then really the thing that ties it together is Lurrus. You can rebuy Dress Down with Lurrus, and that's kind of a sweet interaction. So that's the deck. Mana base, nothing special. This version has an extra basic land. Again, kind of a nod toward shops. I don't really like respecting the shops deck, but I kind of want to do the bare minimum to feel passable there, and I think this does that. We also have an extra white source, I think, over what was stock, or at least the list I stole, just because I found even with the Mox Jet having I mean, Lurrus is not trivial to cast here if you're not doing it off a Lotus, and so having an extra white source just gives you a little bit of better equity there. That's the deck. Sideboard's kind of not surprising. One cool card here is Wear Tear. That was suggested on Twitter yesterday as a replacement for Prismatic Ending. I don't know that I've ever cast the Prismatic Ending for anything other than X = 0 to kill like a Root Walla. So Wear Tear actually sounds really, really sweet as another way to punish Urza Saga gamers, but then also cover that kind of utility card edge that we need. And the rest of this is all pretty straightforward. Fourth Wasteland comes in often. A couple of Crypts. We're not able to play Leyline of the Void, and I think Leyline of the Void is a little bit... It's really good against this deck, but it's also a little bit weak generally right now, since some of the Bazaar decks, at least half the Bazaar decks, are really, really good about playing into Bazaar. But yeah, we'll stop this here, and I'll come back for some actual match review. Thank you for watching. It's going to be a lot of fun.